Before Søren Kierkegaard can be approached as a philosopher, he has to be understood as a problem, not a system builder, not a theorist of society, not a thinker offering answers to be applied, but a man who made his own existence the site of philosophical pressure. Kierkegaard is different because his philosophy does not begin with the world. It begins with the individual standing alone within it. Most philosophy tries to explain reality from above, through systems, concepts, or universal principles. Kierkegaard moves in the opposite direction. He writes from inside anxiety, inside contradiction, inside faith, inside despair. His thought does not aim to resolve these states, it aims to expose them, often painfully, so that the reader is forced to confront their own. This is why Kierkegaard cannot be separated from his life. His ideas do not float free of biography, they are sharpened by it. His writing is inseparable from guilt inherited from his father, from a broken engagement that defined his adulthood, from a lifelong tension with Christianity as a lived demand rather than a social identity. Kierkegaard does not write about despair because it is an abstract condition. He writes about it because he lived inside it. Unlike later existentialists, Kierkegaard does not frame freedom as empowerment or rebellion. Freedom for him is terrifying. It produces anxiety. It forces responsibility. It exposes the self to itself. Where other philosophers promise clarity, Kierkegaard insists on inward struggle. This inwardness is not introspection for its own sake, it is ethical. Kierkegaard believes that the greatest danger of modern life is not ignorance, but avoidance, the tendency to hide inside roles, systems, institutions, and explanations that prevent the individual from becoming a self. That is why Kierkegaard rejects systems of philosophy, especially those that claim to explain everything. A system may be intellectually impressive, but it cannot be lived. It dissolves the individual into concepts. Kierkegaard refuses that dissolution. Instead, he writes in fragments, voices, pseudonyms, and contradictions. He does not tell the reader what to think. He sets traps. He provokes discomfort. He forces choices without guaranteeing that any choice will feel secure. To read Kierkegaard properly is not to extract doctrines. It is to undergo pressure. This is why he is often misunderstood. He is taken as a religious writer, a proto-existentialist, a psychologist, or a literary stylist. He is all of these, and none of them comfortably. Kierkegaard does not belong to a discipline. He attacks the comfort each discipline offers. This video treats Kierkegaard's life and works as a single movement, a man trying to live honestly under conditions of faith, anxiety, and isolation, and producing one of the most psychologically penetrating bodies of work in philosophy as a result. To understand Kierkegaard, we must resist the urge to summarize him quickly. His thought does not reward speed, it rewards attention, and it begins with the man himself. Søren Kierkegaard was born in 1813 into a world that appeared stable, orderly, and self-confident, and that appearance mattered. The Denmark of Kierkegaard's childhood was small, Lutheran, respectable, and deeply invested in social harmony. It was not a society gripped by open revolution or chaos. It was a society convinced it had already found its balance. This conviction is precisely what Kierkegaard would spend his life resisting. Copenhagen in the early 19th century was intellectually provincial, but philosophically ambitious. German thought dominated the universities, especially the vast, all-encompassing system of Hegel. Philosophy promised total explanation, history, ethics, religion, and reason woven together into a rational whole. Nothing, in principle, lay outside the system. At the same time, Christianity in Denmark had become something comfortable, institutional, and socially integrated. One was Christian by default, by birth, by citizenship, by custom. Faith was no longer something one became through struggle. It was something one possessed as a cultural identity. This combination was decisive. On the one hand, philosophy claimed to explain everything. On the other, religion demanded nothing. Between them, the individual disappeared. Kierkegaard saw this disappearance not as progress, but as danger. He grew up in a society where people spoke confidently about truth, morality, and faith, yet rarely seemed to suffer under their weight. Christianity had become polite, philosophy had become abstract, existence itself had been smoothed over. This smoothing is what Kierkegaard found intolerable. Unlike societies in open crisis, Denmark did not force individuals to confront themselves. It allowed them to hide inside respectability. Kierkegaard believed this concealment was more spiritually corrosive than open unbelief. When faith costs nothing, it means nothing. Copenhagen was also a city where everyone watched everyone else. It was small enough that reputation mattered intensely. Public opinion functioned as a quiet but powerful force. Kierkegaard would later describe the public as an abstraction that dissolves responsibility, a crowd that no one belongs to and no one answers for. This early experience of social visibility without accountability shaped his thinking profoundly. Kierkegaard did not reject society because it was oppressive in an obvious sense. He rejected it because it made inwardness unnecessary. One could live an entire life without ever being forced to confront despair, guilt, or faith honestly. The modern individual, Kierkegaard believed, was being anesthetized. It is important to understand this context because Kierkegaard's later severity is often mistaken for eccentricity or personal pathology. In reality, it is a reaction to a world that had made existence too easy on the surface, and therefore hollow underneath. Where his contemporaries sought reconciliation, Kierkegaard insisted on tension. Where they sought synthesis, he insisted on division. Where they sought explanation, he insisted on decision. This is why Kierkegaard never tried to reform society in the usual sense. He did not propose political programs or social reforms. He targeted something more elusive and more threatening, the individual's relationship to themselves. The world Kierkegaard was born into had already decided what a good life looked like. His philosophy begins by asking whether anyone had actually lived it, and that question would soon become intensely personal. To understand Søren Kierkegaard's inner world, one must understand the figure who loomed over it from the beginning, his father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard. More than any book, doctrine, or university education, it was his father who shaped the emotional and spiritual atmosphere in which Kierkegaard's thought developed. Michael Kierkegaard was a deeply religious man, but not a comforting one. His faith was severe, inward, and haunted by guilt. As a young man, impoverished and alone on the Jutland Heath, he is said to have cursed God in despair. This act, whether literally or symbolically true, became foundational within the family narrative. Michael believed the curse had consequences. He believed God would punish him and that his children would bear the weight of that punishment. This belief was not merely theological, it was existential. The household Kierkegaard grew up in was permeated by an atmosphere of seriousness, introspection, and foreboding. Joy was present, but it was restrained. Laughter existed, but it was shadowed. Life was lived under the constant awareness of sin, judgment, and divine scrutiny. God was not a source of reassurance. God was an absolute before whom one stood exposed. For the young Kierkegaard, this produced an intense inwardness at an early age. He learned to look inside himself rather than outward. He learned to treat suffering as meaningful. He learned that despair was not simply an emotion, but a condition with spiritual significance. Long before he theorized anxiety or despair, he experienced them as lived realities. The early deaths of several of his siblings reinforced this sense of doom. Michael Kierkegaard interpreted these losses as confirmation of divine punishment. Søren absorbed this interpretation. He grew up believing that life was fragile, temporary, and lived under a kind of inherited sentence. This belief did not crush him into passivity, it sharpened him. Kierkegaard developed an extraordinary sensitivity to inner states, guilt, dread, hope, resignation. He became acutely aware of how belief shapes perception, how interpretation can transform suffering into destiny. His later philosophical analyses of despair and anxiety are not speculative. They are clinical, precise, and unsparing because they are drawn from lived experience. At the same time, Kierkegaard's relationship with his father was not simply oppressive. It was intellectually nurturing. Michael Kierkegaard was a man of learning who encouraged Søren's education, funded his studies, and took his intellectual gifts seriously. The household was one of conversation, reflection, and seriousness of thought. This combination, intellectual encouragement paired with existential weight, produced a unique tension. Kierkegaard inherited from his father both a sense of spiritual seriousness and a burden of guilt. He would later spend his life examining this inheritance, not to escape it, but to understand it. His philosophy can be read as a prolonged attempt to answer a single question first posed in childhood. What does it mean to exist before God as an individual, without refuge in innocent society or explanation? This question does not lead Kierkegaard toward comfort. It leads him toward clarity, and clarity for him is never painless. The figure of the father remains present throughout Kierkegaard's work, often indirectly. Themes of inherited guilt, divine demand, and the impossibility of resting securely in social religion all trace back to this formative relationship. Even Kierkegaard's later critique of Christendom carries the imprint of his father's severity. Christianity, if it is true, cannot be easy. His father gave him both a wound and a vocation. Without this early exposure to guilt, melancholy, and inward seriousness, Kierkegaard's philosophy would not exist in its distinctive form. It is here, in the quiet intensity of his childhood home, that the psychological foundations of his thought are laid. From this inward formation, Kierkegaard would soon step into the wider intellectual world, already marked, already different, and already burdened with questions no system could resolve. When Søren Kierkegaard entered formal education, he did not arrive as a blank slate. He arrived already inwardly formed, burdened by seriousness, sharpened by reflection, and unusually attuned to the inner life. His schooling did not create his philosophical temperament, it gave it language. At the University of Copenhagen, Kierkegaard studied theology and philosophy, fields that in his time were deeply intertwined. Theology was not merely religious instruction, it was a cultural authority. Philosophy, meanwhile, was dominated by German idealism, above all, the towering influence of Hegel. Hegel's philosophy promised something unprecedented, a complete system of reality. History, reason, ethics, religion, and politics were all to be reconciled within a single rational structure. Nothing was ultimately irrational. Nothing was finally unresolved. Contradiction itself was absorbed and explained. For many, this was exhilarating. For Kierkegaard, it was suffocating. Intellectually, he admired Hegel's brilliance. He understood the system deeply. He could move within it with ease. But existentially, he felt erased by it. Hegel's philosophy explained everything, except what it felt like to exist as a single individual who must choose, suffer, believe, and die. The problem was not that the system was false. The problem was that it was unlivable. Kierkegaard began to sense that philosophy had confused explanation with existence. One could understand freedom conceptually, while avoiding it personally. One could explain faith historically, while never risking it inwardly. One could speak about ethics universally, while never becoming ethically responsible as an individual. This distinction becomes decisive. During these years, Kierkegaard developed an extraordinary style of thinking, analytical yet ironic, rigorous yet deeply personal. He kept extensive journals in which philosophical reflection blended with self-examination. Ideas were never neutral. They were always tested against life. He also became acutely aware of the dangers of abstraction. Philosophy, he believed, had begun to speak about existence instead of speaking to the existing person. It offered answers that relieved tension rather than intensified responsibility. Kierkegaard did not want relief, he wanted honesty. This is why he never simply rejected philosophy, he turned it against itself. Rather than constructing a counter-system, Kierkegaard would later fragment philosophy into voices, stages, and pseudonyms. He would refuse to speak with a single authoritative tone. The seeds of this method are already present in his education, an awareness that philosophy becomes dangerous when it forgets the individual who must live with its conclusions. Kierkegaard's academic career could have followed a conventional path. He was brilliant enough, he had the means, but something held him back. Scholarship alone felt like evasion. Writing treatises felt too safe. He sensed that his task was not to advance knowledge, but to reintroduce risk into thought. Education sharpened this sense of vocation, rather than resolving it. By the time Kierkegaard completed his studies, he had already formed the conviction that would guide his life's work. Truth is not primarily a matter of correct propositions, but of how a person exists in relation to what they claim to believe. This conviction placed him at odds with the intellectual culture around him. It also set him on a solitary path. The university gave Kierkegaard tools. It did not give him peace. Instead, it clarified the tension that would soon spill into his writing, his personal life, and his most painful decision, one that would define his existence as decisively as any book. That decision was still to come. If Kierkegaard's childhood formed the emotional depth of his philosophy, and his education gave it intellectual precision, his relationship with Regine Olsen gave it its defining wound. No event in Kierkegaard's adult life mattered more, and none was more deliberately chosen. In 1840, Kierkegaard became engaged to Regine Olsen. By all external measures, the match made sense. Regine was intelligent, lively, and deeply attached to him. Kierkegaard, though melancholic and inward, was capable of warmth, humor, and affection. Their engagement was real. It was not a mistake, a whim, or an illusion. And yet, within a year, Kierkegaard broke it off. This decision was not the result of fading love. It was the result of conflict, not between two people, but within Kierkegaard himself. He believed that to marry Regine would require him to live a life of ethical normalcy, domestic responsibility, social stability, outward happiness. There was nothing wrong with this life. That was precisely the problem. Kierkegaard believed he could not live it honestly. He saw himself as called to a different task, one that required solitude, inward suffering, and relentless self-examination. To bind Regine to that task would, in his view, be a form of cruelty. He believed that his own melancholy, anxiety, and religious seriousness would make him incapable of giving her the kind of life she deserved. But this is only part of the story. Kierkegaard did not simply walk away quietly. He made the break in a way that would ensure Regine could move on. He allowed himself to appear fickle, unstable, even morally suspect. He absorbed the blame. He accepted misunderstanding as the cost of the decision. This willingness to be misjudged is crucial. Kierkegaard understood that genuine sacrifice is rarely recognized as such. To act inwardly while appearing outwardly wrong is one of the central themes of his later thought. The individual may be justified before God, yet condemned before society. The breakup haunted him for the rest of his life. Regine appears again and again in his writings, never by name, but as a presence. She becomes the figure through which Kierkegaard explores renunciation, repetition, faith, and loss. The engagement is not a biographical footnote. It is the existential event through which his philosophy crystallizes. In either or, the aesthetic and ethical lives are explored partly through reflections on love and marriage. In Fear and Trembling, the theme of sacrifice is pushed to its extreme. What does it mean to give up what one loves most, not out of necessity, but out of inward conviction? In Repetition, Kierkegaard returns obsessively to the question of whether what is lost can ever be regained, not literally, but spiritually. It is tempting to psychologize this decision. to see it as avoidance, fear, or self-sabotage. Kierkegaard anticipates this temptation. He does not deny that the decision caused suffering. He insists only that suffering does not invalidate it. For Kierkegaard, the highest form of seriousness is not happiness but truthfulness before oneself and before God. He never married. He never stopped loving Regine. Even after she married another man, Kierkegaard continued to regard the broken engagement as the defining choice of his life. It was the moment in which he enacted, rather than merely theorized, the painful logic of inward commitment. This is why Kierkegaard's writings on sacrifice feel so unsettling. They are not moral abstractions. They are reflections written by someone who had already paid a price and continued to pay it daily. The figure of the solitary individual who must choose without assurance, who must accept loss without justification, who must live with the consequences of an inward decision. This figure is not invented. It is Kierkegaard himself. From this point on, his writing takes on a new urgency. The life he might have lived is gone. What remains is the task he believes he must fulfill, and he turns to writing not as consolation, but as vocation. After the break with Regine Olsen, Kierkegaard's writing changes decisively. It becomes more prolific, more inventive, and more difficult to categorize. This difficulty is not stylistic indulgence. It is methodological necessity. Kierkegaard comes to believe that direct communication fails precisely where existence matters most. One cannot be told how to exist. Philosophy, theology, and ethics had all made the same mistake in Kierkegaard's view. They attempted to transmit truth as information. They assumed that if something was explained clearly enough, it could be understood and adopted. Kierkegaard rejects this assumption entirely. The most important truths, he believes, are not learned, they are lived. This leads him to a radical conclusion. If truth concerns existence, then communicating it directly is a form of deception. Direct instruction invites imitation without inward transformation. It produces agreement rather than commitment. The listener nods, but nothing changes. Kierkegaard calls his alternative indirect communication. Instead of speaking in his own voice, he invents pseudonyms. Each pseudonym represents a way of existing rather than a doctrine to accept. These voices argue, contradict one another, seduce the reader, confuse them, and sometimes mislead them. This is deliberate. The reader is not supposed to ask, "What does Kierkegaard believe?" The reader is supposed to ask, "Where am I in this?" Indirect communication works by forcing the reader into a position of choice. No authoritative voice arrives to settle matters. No conclusion is handed down. The reader must decide which voice resonates, which collapses, and which demands transformation. This is not literary playfulness, it is ethical pressure. Kierkegaard believes that modern individuals hide behind objectivity. They speak about love, faith, and ethics as if these were topics rather than commitments. Indirect communication breaks this habit. It removes the safety of detachment. Irony becomes one of his primary tools. Irony unsettles. It refuses to say plainly what one should think. It destabilizes certainty without offering a replacement. Kierkegaard uses irony not to mock truth, but to strip away false seriousness, the kind that speaks confidently without being existentially invested. He also uses contradiction. Different pseudonyms advance incompatible positions. Some celebrate pleasure and immediacy. Others defend ethical duty. Others retreat into religious inwardness. Kierkegaard does not resolve these tensions for the reader. He stages them. This staging mirrors existence itself. Life does not arrive as a solved problem. It arrives as competing demands that cannot be harmonized without loss. Kierkegaard refuses to smooth over this loss philosophically. He insists that choosing always costs something, and that philosophy must honor that cost rather than disguise it. Importantly, Kierkegaard does not hide behind his pseudonyms. He remains responsible for them. He later explains that indirect communication is not evasion, but discipline. It prevents the author from becoming an authority figure whose conclusions can be adopted without inward struggle. This is why Kierkegaard's works often frustrate readers. They resist summarization. They refuse closure. They seem to circle rather than conclude. This is not a failure of clarity. It is fidelity to the subject matter. Existence cannot be systematized without distortion. By fragmenting his voice, Kierkegaard ensures that his philosophy cannot be consumed passively. The reader must participate. They must locate themselves. They must confront discomfort rather than resolve it intellectually. This method also reflects Kierkegaard's own life. He lives without reconciliation between faith and reason, love and vocation, inward conviction and public misunderstanding. His writing does not heal these fractures. It exposes them as conditions of honest existence. Indirect communication, then, is not a trick. It is a demand. It insists that truth is not something one possesses, but something one becomes, slowly, painfully, and without guarantee. With this method in place, Kierkegaard begins to publish the works that will define his legacy. He does not announce their purpose. He releases them into the world like tests. The first of these tests confronts a way of life built on pleasure, immediacy, and avoidance, a life that seems attractive, free, and sophisticated, yet quietly collapses under its own weight. That confrontation begins with either-or. When either-or appears in 1843, it does not announce itself as a philosophical treatise. It arrives disguised as literature, criticism, diary, sermon, and seduction. This is not accidental. Kierkegaard wants the reader to enter a way of life before judging it. He wants the aesthetic life to be experienced from the inside. The aesthetic life, as Kierkegaard presents it, is not crude hedonism. It is refined, ironic, intelligent, and self-aware. The aesthete seeks pleasure, but more importantly, seeks avoidance of commitment. Life is treated as something to be enjoyed, curated, and kept open rather than chosen. Boredom is the aesthete's great enemy. To avoid it, the aesthete cultivates variety, mood, and distance. Relationships are experienced aesthetically rather than ethically. Love becomes seduction. Conversation becomes performance. Irony becomes protection. Nothing is allowed to become binding. This life appears free. The aesthete believes they have escaped responsibility by refusing to choose. They drift between possibilities, convinced that keeping options open preserves freedom. Kierkegaard exposes the illusion at the heart of this stance. Refusing to choose is itself a choice. In either-or, this exposure is staged rather than argued. The aesthetic voice is persuasive, witty, and often seductive. Kierkegaard does not caricature it. He lets it speak fully. Only gradually does its instability emerge. The aesthete depends on conditions they cannot control: mood, novelty, admiration, stimulation. When these falter, despair appears, not dramatically, but quietly. Life loses intensity. Pleasure becomes repetition. Irony turns hollow. This despair is not recognized as despair. That is crucial. Kierkegaard insists that the most dangerous form of despair is the one that does not know it is despair. The aesthete believes they are living well, even as meaning drains away. They feel dissatisfaction without understanding why. Here, Kierkegaard introduces one of his most penetrating insights. Despair does not always feel tragic. It often feels empty. The aesthetic life collapses not because it is immoral, but because it is unsustainable. It lacks continuity. It cannot carry a self across time. Without commitment, there is no self to preserve. This is why Kierkegaard insists that the aesthetic life eventually confronts a moment of crisis. Not necessarily dramatic, but decisive. The individual must either deepen their despair through continued evasion or step into responsibility through choice. This step is not automatic. Kierkegaard does not say that the ethical life is obviously superior or emotionally easier. He says only that without choice, existence disintegrates. The aesthetic life avoids pain by avoiding depth, and in doing so, loses itself, either or ends without resolution. The reader is not told what to do. Instead, they are placed before a decision. Do they recognize themselves in the aesthetic voice? Do they feel its attraction? Do they sense its emptiness? If so, Kierkegaard has succeeded. The aesthetic life is not something one outgrows intellectually. It is something one must decide to leave, and that decision, to bind oneself to something that limits freedom, introduces a new mode of existence. That mode is the ethical life, and it is not as secure as it first appears. If the aesthetic life dissolves the self through avoidance, the ethical life emerges as an attempt to hold the self together. Where the aesthete lives through moods and moments, the ethical individual lives through commitment, responsibility, and continuity over time. For Kierkegaard, the ethical life begins with choice, not the selection of an option, but the decision to bind oneself to a way of being. To choose ethically is to say, "This is who I will be," even when desire shifts, enthusiasm fades, or circumstances become difficult. The ethical individual takes themselves seriously. Marriage, work, promise, and duty are not merely social institutions in this framework. They are existential structures. They give the self shape across time. They allow a person to recognize themselves as the same individual yesterday, today, and tomorrow. This is why Kierkegaard treats marriage with such gravity. Marriage represents continuity, responsibility, and the acceptance of limitation. It is the opposite of aesthetic seduction. It demands fidelity not just to another person, but to one's own decision. In marriage, one does not reinvent oneself daily. One sustains oneself. At first glance, the ethical life seems like the solution the aesthetic life lacks. It offers stability instead of drift, meaning instead of stimulation, identity instead of irony. The ethical individual can look at their life and say, "This has coherence. There is dignity in this coherence. There is also seriousness." But Kierkegaard does not let the ethical life rest here. He introduces a deeper tension. The ethical life, for all its responsibility, remains universal. Ethical norms apply to everyone. Duty is shared. Right and wrong are publicly recognizable. This universality gives ethics its authority, but it also introduces a limit. The ethical individual understands themselves through categories that apply to all. They are a spouse, a worker, a citizen, a moral agent. These roles give meaning, but they also risk becoming another form of concealment. One can live ethically and still avoid oneself. Kierkegaard insists that ethical seriousness does not guarantee inward honesty. One can fulfill duties outwardly while remaining inwardly disengaged. One can live responsibly and still fail to exist authentically before God. This is not an attack on ethics. It is a diagnosis of its boundary. The ethical life presupposes a stable self that chooses responsibility. But Kierkegaard begins to ask, what if the self itself is unstable? What if despair operates even within ethical commitment? What if one fulfills every duty and still feels inwardly divided? Here, Kierkegaard's thought deepens. The ethical life can confront despair, but it cannot finally resolve it. It can organize existence, but it cannot heal the self's relationship to itself. Ethics can say what one ought to do. It cannot say how one becomes oneself in the deepest sense. This insight is unsettling. It suggests that moral seriousness is necessary but insufficient. It suggests that responsibility alone does not resolve the tension between finitude and freedom, between the individual and the absolute. Kierkegaard does not abandon ethics. He honors it, but he refuses to make it ultimate. To do so would be to confuse social order with existential truth. The ethical life demands integrity, but integrity alone does not address the individual's relationship to guilt, anxiety, and despair at the deepest level. These phenomena do not disappear when one chooses well. In some cases, they intensify. This is where Kierkegaard begins to move beyond ethics toward a more radical confrontation with existence. The ethical individual has chosen, they have taken responsibility, and still something remains unresolved. That unresolved remainder is not a failure of ethics. It is a signal that existence reaches deeper than universal duty. The next question Kierkegaard asks is not moral, but existential. What happens when freedom itself becomes visible, when the individual confronts not just obligation, but possibility? The answer to that question is anxiety. When Kierkegaard turns to anxiety, he does not treat it as a psychological disorder or an emotional weakness. He treats it as a revelation. Anxiety is not something that happens to the self from the outside. It arises from the very structure of human freedom. In the concept of anxiety, Kierkegaard draws a crucial distinction. Anxiety is not fear. Fear has an object. One fears something specific, a threat, a danger, a loss. Anxiety has no object. It is the dizziness that appears when the individual becomes aware of their own freedom. Anxiety emerges when possibility becomes visible. The individual realizes that they are not determined. They could act otherwise. They could choose differently. They could become something else. This openness is not experienced as liberation. It is experienced as vertigo. Freedom, Kierkegaard insists, is frightening. This claim runs directly against the modern tendency to treat freedom as empowerment. For Kierkegaard, freedom is the condition that makes responsibility unavoidable. When nothing compels action, the individual must answer for it themselves. Anxiety marks the moment when this responsibility becomes conscious. This is why anxiety cannot be eliminated without eliminating freedom. Kierkegaard describes anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, an image that captures its ambiguity. Dizziness is not falling. It is the awareness that one could fall. The ground has not disappeared, but the certainty that one will remain standing has. This ambiguity is essential. Anxiety is not pathological. It is pedagogical. It teaches the individual that they are not simply part of the natural order, not merely driven by instinct or necessity. They are capable of choice, and therefore capable of guilt. Kierkegaard links anxiety directly to the emergence of selfhood. Before anxiety, the individual drifts within roles, habits, and expectations. Anxiety interrupts this drift. It forces the individual to confront themselves as a chooser. This confrontation is uncomfortable, destabilizing, and often resisted. Many attempt to flee anxiety. They distract themselves, conform to social expectations, lose themselves in activity, or retreat into explanation. Kierkegaard sees all of these as evasions. Anxiety cannot be cured by avoidance. It returns whenever freedom reasserts itself. Importantly, Kierkegaard does not claim that anxiety leads inevitably to growth. Anxiety can paralyze. It can overwhelm. It can drive the individual back into aesthetic distraction or ethical rigidity. The presence of anxiety does not guarantee authenticity. It only makes it possible. This is a crucial distinction. Freedom opens the space for responsibility, but it does not compel it. Anxiety reveals the stakes, but it does not decide the outcome. The individual must still choose how to respond. Kierkegaard also insists that anxiety is not evenly distributed. It intensifies where individuals confront serious choices, where the self must be shaped rather than inherited. This is why anxiety becomes more pronounced in modern life, where traditional structures no longer fully determine identity. In this sense, Kierkegaard anticipates modern psychology without reducing anxiety to pathology. Anxiety is not a symptom to be eliminated. It is a signal that the self is awake. But this awakening is dangerous. Anxiety exposes the individual to despair. It reveals not only freedom, but fragility. The self realizes it can fail, not just externally, but inwardly. It can refuse itself. It can become divided. This insight prepares the ground for Kierkegaard's most penetrating analysis, despair. Anxiety reveals freedom. Despair reveals what happens when the self fails to relate properly to that freedom. If anxiety is the dizziness of possibility, despair is the sickness that arises when the self cannot bear what it sees. And that sickness, Kierkegaard insists, is far more widespread than anyone suspects. When Kierkegaard turns to despair in the sickness unto death, he makes one of his most radical claims. Despair is not a rare condition. It is not confined to those who appear broken, depressed, or visibly suffering. Despair, he insists, is nearly universal and often invisible. Despair is not simply a feeling, it is a condition of the self. To understand this, Kierkegaard first defines what the self is. The self is not a substance or a static identity. It is a relation that relates itself to itself, a dynamic tension between opposing elements, finitude and infinitude, necessity and possibility, body and spirit. To be a self is to hold these opposites together without collapsing into either extreme. Despair arises when this relation fails. There are many ways it can fail. The self can refuse to become itself. It can lose itself in roles, distractions, or expectations. It can deny its freedom by pretending it is determined. Or it can inflate its freedom by imagining itself limitless, detached from constraint or responsibility. Kierkegaard maps despair with clinical precision. One form of despair is unconscious despair, the most dangerous kind. Here, the individual does not know they are in despair. They function well, they appear successful, they may even feel content, but they live without inward selfhood. They are absorbed in the world, defined entirely by external markers, status, productivity, social identity. This form of despair is not dramatic. It is quiet, stable, and socially rewarded. Another form is despair of weakness. Here the individual becomes aware of their self but cannot bear it. They feel inadequate, guilty, or overwhelmed. They want to escape themselves. They long to be someone else, or to disappear into necessity, to be determined rather than responsible. This despair often looks like resignation. The individual accepts limitation, but only by surrendering inwardly. The final and most intense form is despair of defiance. Here, the individual embraces freedom but refuses dependence. They attempt to create themselves entirely on their own terms. They reject any authority, including God, and insist on self-sufficiency. This despair is not weakness, it is rebellion. Yet Kierkegaard insists that all these forms share the same structure. The self is misrelated to itself. It either refuses one side of its nature or absolutizes the other. In every case, the self fails to accept itself as both finite and free. This is why Kierkegaard calls despair a sickness, but not one that ends in death. Despair is the sickness unto death, meaning it threatens the self's integrity rather than the body's life. One can live a full lifespan in despair without ever recognizing it. In fact, Kierkegaard believes this is the default condition of modern existence. Despair becomes visible when anxiety has already done its work. Anxiety reveals freedom. Despair reveals what happens when the self cannot bear the weight of that freedom. It is not freedom itself that destroys the self. It is the refusal to relate honestly to it. Crucially, Kierkegaard does not treat despair as something to be cured through therapy, distraction, or social reform. These may ease symptoms, but they do not address the underlying misrelation. Despair, in its deepest sense, is not psychological but existential. It concerns how the self stands in relation to itself and ultimately in relation to the absolute. This is where Kierkegaard's analysis becomes religious. The self, he argues, cannot fully ground itself. To try to do so is defiant despair. To deny this need is weak despair. The self becomes whole only when it accepts that it is grounded in something beyond itself, something it did not create and cannot control. This acceptance is not comforting. It requires surrender without certainty, dependence without security, faith without proof. Kierkegaard does not soften this demand. He insists that despair can only be overcome by a transformation that is inward, absolute and personal. This brings Kierkegaard to the edge of ethics and psychology and beyond them. Despair shows that choosing rightly is not enough. Acting responsibly is not enough. Understanding oneself intellectually is not enough. The self's deepest problem is not ignorance or immorality, but misrelation. And this misrelation cannot be repaired by universal rules or social norms. It demands something more radical. It demands faith. When Kierkegaard turns to faith, he does not present it as an answer that resolves despair. He presents it as a response that deepens responsibility. Faith, for Kierkegaard, is not reassurance, it is risk. This is the point where his thought breaks decisively with both philosophy and conventional religion. Philosophy seeks understanding, ethics seeks justification. Religion, as Kierkegaard encounters it in his society, seeks comfort and social belonging. Faith, as Kierkegaard understands it, seeks none of these. Faith is a mode of existence, not a belief system. It does not explain suffering. It does not remove anxiety. It does not harmonize contradiction. Faith intensifies inwardness. The religious life begins where ethics reaches its limit. Ethics speaks in universal terms, duties that apply to all, norms that can be explained and defended publicly. Faith, by contrast, is irreducibly individual. It concerns how a single person stands before the absolute, without mediation, without guarantees, and without public justification. This is why Kierkegaard insists that faith cannot be social. One cannot inherit it. One cannot demonstrate it. One cannot prove it to others. The moment faith seeks validation through consensus or explanation, it ceases to be faith and becomes ideology or culture. Kierkegaard describes the religious life as one of infinite resignation followed by something even more paradoxical. Infinite resignation is the willingness to give up what one loves most, not reluctantly but fully. It is the acceptance that finitude cannot provide ultimate meaning. The individual relinquishes their claims on the world, not because the world is evil, but because it is insufficient. But resignation alone is not faith. Faith begins when, having relinquished everything, the individual nevertheless believes, without reason, that what has been given up will be restored. Not restored by logic, not by ethics, not by probability, but by trust in the absurd. This is where Kierkegaard becomes most difficult. Faith is not belief in doctrines. It is trust without evidence. It is commitment without explanation. It is the courage to act as if meaning is real, even when reason cannot secure it. This is why Kierkegaard insists that faith is not heroic. The knight of faith does not look extraordinary. They live outwardly ordinary lives. What distinguishes them is not visible action, but inward relation. They carry contradiction without resolving it. They live with tension rather than dissolving it. This inward solitude is essential. Faith cannot be shared as experience. It cannot be taught as method. It cannot be transferred as knowledge. Each individual must confront the absolute alone. This loneliness is not accidental. It is the condition of faith's seriousness. Kierkegaard contrasts this sharply with Christendom, the institutional religion of his time. Christendom, he argues, replaces faith with familiarity. It makes Christianity easy, respectable, and socially rewarded. In doing so, it evacuates its existential demand. True faith, Kierkegaard insists, would be terrifying if taken seriously. It would demand sacrifice, isolation, misunderstanding, and the willingness to stand alone before God without explanation. This is not a path most people want, and Kierkegaard does not pretend otherwise. Faith is not for everyone. This does not make it elitist. It makes it honest. Kierkegaard refuses to universalize faith as an obligation. He insists only that those who claim it must recognize its cost. To call something faith while removing its danger is to lie to oneself. This is why Kierkegaard's religious thought feels abrasive rather than consoling. He does not offer faith as relief from despair. He offers it as a transformation of how despair is born. Faith does not eliminate suffering. It reorients it. The individual who lives religiously does not escape anxiety or despair. They accept them without allowing them to define the self completely. They live without guarantees, yet without despairing over the absence of guarantees. This is the most demanding mode of existence Kierkegaard describes. It cannot be justified ethically. It cannot be defended philosophically. It can only be lived. To make this demand concrete, to show what faith looks like when pushed to its extreme, Kierkegaard turns to a single biblical figure and a single story. A story that forces faith and ethics into open conflict. That story is Abraham. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard stages the most disturbing thought experiment in his entire body of work. He does not soften it, he does not resolve it, he does not explain it away. Instead, he insists that the reader remain inside its terror. The story is simple and unbearable. Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. He prepares to obey. He does not protest. He does not explain. He does not justify himself to anyone. He walks toward Mount Moriah in silence. For Kierkegaard, this silence is the key. Ethically, Abraham is indefensible. Ethics speaks universally. It forbids murder. It demands justification that can be shared and defended. By ethical standards, Abraham is either a murderer or a madman. There is no third option. And yet, Kierkegaard insists, Abraham is praised as a figure of faith. This creates an impossible tension. If ethics is the highest authority, then Abraham must be condemned. If Abraham is truly faithful, then ethics must be suspended. Kierkegaard refuses to dissolve this contradiction. He names it the teleological suspension of the ethical. This phrase is deliberately provocative. It does not mean that ethics is false. It means that ethics is not ultimate. In faith, the individual relates directly to the absolute, to God, in a way that cannot be mediated by universal norms. The individual stands alone, without explanation, without defense, and without appeal. This is where faith becomes terrifying. Abraham cannot explain himself to Sarah. He cannot justify himself to Isaac. He cannot defend himself to society. If he is wrong, he is unforgivable. If he is right, he will still appear monstrous. Faith offers no outward signs of legitimacy. This is why Kierkegaard insists that faith is not heroic. A hero can be admired. Their actions can be explained. Their sacrifice makes sense within a shared moral framework. Abraham cannot be admired ethically. He can only be feared, and trembling follows fear. Kierkegaard contrasts Abraham with tragic heroes like Agamemnon, who sacrifices his daughter for the sake of the state. Tragic heroes can justify their actions. Their suffering is public. Their sacrifice is intelligible. Abraham's is not. He acts without justification. He acts without certainty. He acts without assurance that his action will be redeemed. He believes, absurdly, that Isaac will be restored, even as he raises the knife. This belief is the leap of faith. The leap is not a moment of emotional intensity. It is not a surge of confidence. It is a decision made without rational support. Abraham does not calculate. He trusts, and trust here means exposure without guarantee. Kierkegaard is explicit. Faith cannot be taught from this story. If one tries to imitate Abraham, one becomes dangerous. Faith cannot be generalized. It cannot be legislated. It cannot be turned into a rule. The story does not tell us what to do. It tells us what faith costs. This is why Fear and Trembling is often misunderstood. Some read it as glorifying blind obedience. Kierkegaard rejects this entirely. Abraham's action cannot be justified by appeal to authority or command alone. Faith is not submission to power. It is a solitary relation to the absolute that offers no security and no validation. Others try to moralize the story, to soften it into symbolism. Kierkegaard refuses this too. The story must remain offensive, or it loses its meaning. Faith that no longer offends reason is no longer faith. Kierkegaard's aim is not to make us admire Abraham. It is to make us recognize how far faith lies beyond comfort, reason, and ethics. Faith is not a higher morality. It is a different mode of existence altogether. one that cannot be explained, defended, or shared. This is why Kierkegaard insists that the night of faith appears ordinary. There are no visible signs, no halo, no drama. Faith is entirely inward. From the outside, Abraham looks like a father taking his son on a journey. From the inside, he is walking through absolute terror. The reader is left with no resolution. Either faith is real and ethics is not ultimate, or ethics is ultimate and faith is illusion. Kierkegaard does not choose for us. He leaves us in the space of decision. That space is where his philosophy always wants the reader to stand. Fear and Trembling does not tell us to believe. It tells us what belief would demand. And most readers, Kierkegaard knows, will recoil. That recoil is not failure. It is honesty. Faith, if it exists, is not safe. Kierkegaard's conflict with Hegel is not a technical dispute between philosophers. It is an existential revolt. Hegel represents for Kierkegaard everything that modern thought had begun to prize at the expense of lived existence: system, totality, reconciliation, and explanation without risk. Hegel's philosophy claims that reality is rational through and through. History unfolds dialectically. Contradictions are not final. They are moments that will be overcome. Reason ultimately reconciles what appears opposed. From this perspective, individual suffering, doubt, and despair are absorbed into a larger, intelligible process. For Kierkegaard, this is precisely the problem. A system that explains everything leaves no room for the individual who must live without explanation. Hegel's philosophy may be intellectually magnificent, but it speaks from nowhere in particular. It sees history, but not the person who must choose within it. It understands faith conceptually, but never risks it. Kierkegaard's objection is simple and devastating. Existence cannot be systematized. A system may be complete, but no one can live inside it. No system can tell an individual how to exist when they must choose, suffer, repent, or believe. These moments do not arrive dialectically. They arrive personally, urgently, and without synthesis. Hegel's philosophy, Kierkegaard argues, confuses understanding with existence. To understand something is not to be it. One can understand love without loving. One can understand ethics without acting ethically. One can understand faith without believing. Hegel's system explains these phenomena from the outside, but Kierkegaard insists that what matters occurs on the inside. This is why Kierkegaard famously declares, "Subjectivity is truth." This statement is often misunderstood. Kierkegaard does not mean that truth is whatever one feels. He means that the highest truths are truths of existence, truths that only become real when they are lived. Objective certainty is irrelevant if the individual remains unchanged. In Kierkegaard's view, Hegel's system encourages spectatorship. It invites individuals to contemplate reality rather than commit themselves within it. It offers reconciliation without cost. It transforms faith into philosophy and ethics into theory. In doing so, it removes danger from existence. Kierkegaard refuses this removal. He insists that contradiction cannot always be resolved. Some tensions must be lived rather than explained away. Faith and reason, individuality and universality, finitude and infinitude. These are not puzzles to be solved, but conditions to be endured. This is why Kierkegaard's writing is deliberately unsystematic. He fragments, repeats, contradicts, and masks. He refuses to give the reader a position of mastery. To understand Kierkegaard too easily is to misunderstand him. The clash with Hegel is therefore symbolic. It represents two visions of philosophy. One seeks to comprehend the whole, the other seeks to awaken the individual. One aims at reconciliation, the other insists on responsibility. One speaks in the voice of reason, the other speaks in the voice of existence. Kierkegaard does not defeat Hegel philosophically. He sidesteps him existentially. He asks a question the system cannot answer. How should I live? Not in general, not historically, but here, now, as this individual. That question marks the limit of system and the beginning of inwardness. From this conflict, Kierkegaard's isolation deepens. He stands against the dominant intellectual current of his time, refusing its comforts and rejecting its authority. This isolation will soon turn outward, not only against philosophy, but against the very form of Christianity practiced in his society. That confrontation will define his final years. In the final years of his life, Kierkegaard turns from indirect communication to open confrontation. The careful masks, pseudonyms, and literary indirection give way to a direct and uncompromising attack on what he calls Christendom, not Christianity itself, but its comfortable, institutionalized form. This turn is not a contradiction of his earlier method, it is its consequence. Kierkegaard comes to believe that indirect communication has reached its limit. His society no longer misunderstands Christianity by accident, it misunderstands it by design. Christianity has been transformed into a cultural identity, a social habit, and a mark of respectability. It demands nothing and risks nothing. This, for Kierkegaard, is not a harmless distortion. It is a spiritual catastrophe. Christendom, as he sees it, has removed the offense from Christianity. It has turned a faith built on suffering, sacrifice, and imitation into a doctrine of comfort and belonging. One is Christian by birth, by citizenship, by participation in public rituals, not by inward struggle. Kierkegaard insists that this empties Christianity of content. To follow Christ, he argues, is not to admire him, quote him, or institutionalize him. It is to imitate him, and imitation involves suffering, rejection, and loss. A Christianity that costs nothing is not Christianity at all. This is why Kierkegaard directs his fiercest criticism at the clergy. He accuses pastors of turning faith into a profession and preaching into performance. They reassure congregations rather than unsettle them. They promise salvation without transformation. They act as if Christianity were a doctrine to be accepted rather than an existence to be lived. Kierkegaard's language becomes deliberately harsh. He mocks the idea that Christianity could ever be compatible with social comfort. He ridicules the notion that one can follow a crucified God while remaining safely embedded in bourgeois respectability. Christianity, if taken seriously, would place the individual in tension with society, not at ease within it. This attack isolates Kierkegaard almost completely. Public opinion turns against him. He becomes a controversial figure, sometimes treated as a fanatic or a nuisance. But Kierkegaard does not retreat. He accepts isolation as confirmation of his position. Truth, he believes, is rarely popular, and popularity is often evidence of distortion. Importantly, Kierkegaard does not propose reform. He does not seek to fix the church, improve its practices, or modernize its message. He rejects reform as another form of evasion. Christianity, he insists, does not need adjustment. It needs honesty. This honesty has a cost. To live as a Christian, in Kierkegaard's sense, would mean standing exposed before God without social validation. It would mean accepting misunderstanding, ridicule, and loneliness. It would mean refusing the safety of the crowd. This demand is so severe that Kierkegaard does not expect many to meet it. He does not call for mass conversion. He calls for seriousness. If Christianity is false, he suggests, it should be abandoned. If it is true, it should not be made easy. This final phase of Kierkegaard's life reveals something essential about his character. He does not soften his thought with age. He sharpens it. He does not seek reconciliation. He accepts rupture. His philosophy ends not in synthesis, but in exposure. This exposure takes a physical toll. Kierkegaard's health deteriorates. He becomes increasingly isolated, yet he continues to write, convinced that clarity matters more than comfort and truth more than acceptance. The attack on Christendom is not an appendix to Kierkegaard's work, it is its existential conclusion. Having examined despair, anxiety, faith, and inwardness, He turns outward to expose a society that has neutralized them all. What remains after this confrontation is not victory, but exhaustion, and soon death. Kierkegaard's final years are marked by exhaustion rather than resolution. There is no reconciliation with the public, no softening of tone, no sense of closure. His life does not conclude with triumph or vindication. It ends with persistence. By the mid-1850s, Kierkegaard is physically weakened, socially isolated, and increasingly consumed by his polemic against Christendom. The strain of sustained confrontation, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual, takes its toll. Yet he does not withdraw. He continues to write because he believes that silence would be a form of betrayal. In 1855, Kierkegaard collapses in the street and is taken to hospital. During his final illness, he refuses communion from a pastor of the state church. This refusal is not theatrical, it is consistent. To accept the sacrament as administered by an institution he believes has hollowed out Christianity would for him be a lie. He dies shortly thereafter at the age of 42. There is something deliberately unresolved about this ending. Kierkegaard does not leave behind a reconciled life or a settled legacy. He leaves behind tension. His death mirrors his philosophy. No synthesis, no final harmony, only the demand that existence be taken seriously to the end. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Kierkegaard is widely misunderstood. Many dismiss him as an eccentric religious fanatic, a failed academic, or a pathological melancholic. His writings are seen as obscure, excessive, or impractical. The very qualities that later generations will recognize as profound, inwardness, psychological depth, refusal of systems, are treated as defects. This misunderstanding is partly due to the nature of his work. Kierkegaard does not offer a philosophy that can be easily taught, summarized, or institutionalized. He leaves no school, no doctrine, no program. His thought resists being turned into a tradition because it targets the very impulse to inherit beliefs without living them. He is also misunderstood because he demands too much. Kierkegaard does not flatter his readers. He does not reassure them that they are already living well. He insists that despair may be invisible, that faith may be absent where it is claimed, and that authenticity requires loss. These are not messages that invite immediate acceptance, and yet beneath the misunderstanding, something endures. Kierkegaard's journals reveal a man who never stopped questioning himself. He does not present his life as exemplary. He presents it as exposed. His willingness to live without guarantees, to accept isolation rather than compromise, and to refuse comfort in favor of honesty, becomes retrospectively the deepest coherence of his life. He dies without knowing the influence he will have. Existentialism, depth psychology, modern theology, and even literary modernism will later draw heavily from his insights. But Kierkegaard never sought influence. He sought truthfulness, even when it cost him everything else. His life ends quietly, but his thought does not. What remains after his death is not a solution to existence, but a challenge that refuses to fade. That the most important questions cannot be delegated to systems, institutions, or crowds, and that the individual must answer for themselves. That challenge is what survives him. Søren Kierkegaard's legacy does not lie in a doctrine that can be applied, a system that can be taught, or a method that can be repeated. It lies in a pressure he places on the individual, a pressure that has not diminished with time, but intensified. Kierkegaard matters because he refuses to let existence become comfortable. He insists that inward life cannot be replaced by explanation, that faith cannot be replaced by culture, that responsibility cannot be dissolved into systems, and that despair cannot be eliminated by distraction. These refusals make his work perpetually relevant in societies that excel at avoidance. In philosophy, Kierkegaard stands as the great opponent of totalizing thought. Where systems promise reconciliation, he insists on irreducible tension. Where abstraction promises clarity, he insists on lived contradiction. His claim that subjectivity is truth reshapes philosophy by relocating seriousness from theory to existence. This move becomes foundational for later existential thinkers, but Kierkegaard remains distinct. Unlike later existentialism, he does not celebrate freedom as liberation. He treats it as burden. He does not frame authenticity as self-expression. He frames it as responsibility before the absolute. In psychology, Kierkegaard's analyses of anxiety and despair anticipate modern depth psychology with remarkable precision. Yet he refuses to reduce these phenomena to pathology. Anxiety is not merely something to be cured, it is something that reveals freedom. Despair is not simply dysfunction, it is a sign that the self is misrelated to itself. This insight remains radical. Modern life often treats inner suffering as a technical problem to be managed. Kierkegaard insists that it is existential, and therefore inseparable from how one lives. This insistence cuts against therapeutic cultures that seek relief without transformation. In theology, Kierkegaard remains deeply unsettling. He strips Christianity of familiarity and exposes it as offense, risk, and demand. He rejects inherited belief, cultural religion, and institutional reassurance. Faith, for Kierkegaard, is not belief in propositions, but trust lived without guarantee. This vision remains difficult precisely because it refuses comfort. Kierkegaard does not offer faith as refuge from despair. He offers it as a way of standing honestly within it. He does not promise happiness, he demands seriousness. But Kierkegaard's relevance is not confined to philosophy, psychology, or theology. He matters because the conditions he diagnosed have intensified. Modern individuals are surrounded by explanations, identities, and systems that promise meaning without commitment. One can belong without choosing, believe without risk, and act without responsibility. Kierkegaard's thought cuts through these arrangements. He insists that one cannot become a self by inheritance. One cannot live truthfully by imitation. One cannot escape responsibility by hiding in the crowd. These claims are not abstract. They speak directly to a world of mass culture, algorithmic identity, performative belief, and diluted responsibility. Kierkegaard also matters because he refuses optimism. He does not promise progress. He does not claim that history moves toward reconciliation. He does not believe that reason will save us from ourselves. He insists only that the individual remains responsible, even when the world offers no reassurance. This refusal makes him difficult to appropriate. He cannot be turned into motivational philosophy. He cannot be absorbed into ideology. He cannot be simplified without being distorted. His work resists consumption. Perhaps this is his greatest legacy. Kierkegaard leaves us without shelter, without systems to hide behind, without identities to rest in, without guarantees to lean on. What remains is the individual confronted with themselves, with freedom, with anxiety, with despair, and with the possibility of faith. He does not tell us what to choose. He insists that we must choose, and that insistence has not aged. As long as human beings avoid themselves, Kierkegaard remains relevant. As long as belief is made easy, he remains necessary. As long as responsibility is diluted, he remains unsettling. Kierkegaard does not solve the problem of existence. He makes it unavoidable.